Men, you are about to listen to an incredible podcast with Tim Barton from Wall Builders that you need to buckle up for. Get your pen and paper, get a cup of coffee, get ready, because Tim is going to bring you some hard-hitting facts about American history and the founding fathers and the foundation of faith and Christianity that our nation was built on. Tim is brilliant, and he's an incredible communicator. You're going to definitely want to like, subscribe, and share this podcast episode with your buddies who you know are interested in American history, or maybe they totally disagree with what they're about to hear, and this is definitely something that they need as well. So listen to this podcast, take some notes. You're going to learn a lot. I know that I did. Here comes Tim Barton and Wall Builders. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Men's Alliance podcast. Guest with us today is Tim Barton. Tim is the president of Wall Builders, and we're going to hear all about that today and have a great conversation about American history. Tim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. Tell us just a little bit about the mission of Wall Builders and what you guys do.
Yeah, we focus primarily on American history. Our main objective is kind of to restore a biblical or the biblical and constitutional foundation upon which our nation was built. We do it through telling a lot of stories of American history. We have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from early American history. We have literally tens of thousands of documents from the founding fathers. We have handwritten documents from every single signer of the Declaration, every single signer of the Constitution. We have documents from every single president. So basically, anybody from American history that you can think of, big names, we probably have something from them, most cases handwritten by them. And so we go back to original documents, original sources to tell the story of America. And the reason that's also important that we're using original documents is because America was built far more on a biblical and Christian foundation than most people have ever been taught. And it actually contradicts a lot of the modern narratives we are taught. And so having those original documents where we can tell people, like, please don't take our word for it, right? Here's what George Washington actually wrote. Here's what Thomas Jefferson actually wrote. And you see that connection. It's a pretty powerful impact, but our mission and goal is trying to rebuild and restore the foundation of America. It's where we got the name Wall Builders from the Bible story, the book of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah wanted to go back and rebuild the walls of his nation. And one of the things he said in Nehemiah 2:17, come, let us rebuild the walls that we may no longer be a reproach or be a disgrace. And back in the 1980s, when my dad first started our organization, he really had a conviction, a challenge, felt like a call from God, looking at America and seeing the chaos, the reproach, the disgrace that America was in, even back in the 1980s. And for those that might not know or remember, this is when it was like all times highs in gang violence in public schools and teen pregnancies and sexually transmitted disease. And it was just crazy what was happening in the nation. And he really was feeling this call of Nehemiah. Let's go back and rebuild this thing. And to rebuild it, you need to understand what that foundation was. And that foundation primarily were the principles of Christianity, were the principles of the Word of God. And that's what we try to show people and teach people from American history.
Wow, man, I absolutely love that. I remember watching VHS tapes of your dad in the 90s when I went to a Christian school, and man, we would watch some of your dad's videos in like history class and civics class stuff. So I've been familiar with you guys a little bit for a long time, although I had no idea that you guys possessed all of these original documents. So you guys are you're a repository, you're a museum, right?
Very much so. We actually have two museums in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We have one closer to Dallas, one on the west side of Fort Worth. Both of them are open to the public. Both, you have to sign up for a tour, but we do tours all throughout the week. And we love to have people come and see this because, again, so much of the truth of American history, it's a contradiction from what we've been taught, and it certainly is contrary to the modern narratives that are prevalent today. And so we want people to be able to see and like hold in their hand things related to the faith of the founding fathers. Well, for example, the founding fathers, every single founding father that signed the Declaration that went on to become a governor, they all issued prayer proclamations where they would call on their state to days of prayer and fasting or prayer and thanksgiving. And in these proclamations, they're explicit listing the things we should pray for. And in virtually every single prayer and fasting proclamation, the very first thing identified is that if there's anyone who doesn't know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, that they would come to know Jesus Christ, that they would confess their sins and repent and be forgiven of their sins. And this is what the founding fathers telling people to pray for. The reason I bring that up is because we have over 800 original prayer proclamations from American history. And so when you're holding a proclamation from John Hancock as governor of Massachusetts, and he's calling on everybody in his state to pray that all those who don't know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior would come to repentance and come to know him. And you're like, what? But once you've held that, then when someone gives you the narrative that none of the founding fathers were Christians, or they were all atheists, agnostics, or deists, or they wanted a separation of church and state, and you're like, wait a second, now if all that you're telling me is true, like that doesn't make sense. They're doing these prayer proclamations and calling for people to like, I'm reading it, to be saved and know Jesus. And so one of the things we really want people to do is be able to hold history for themselves. It gives you a better connection, because most of the way the history is taught today is about dates and dead people, and you need to memorize it and regurgitate it, but you don't know the story. Yeah. And so there's a real disconnect with American history, and we want to reconnect people to some of the history of this nation, and in the midst of it, be able to let you hold things that contradict some of these prevailing narratives that are going on. And so we absolutely invite people to come down. The one over in Dallas, the museum in Dallas, is called the American Journey Experience. And then the one on the west side of Fort Worth is called WallBuilders. Both of them you can find online, sign up for tours. We'd love to have people come check it out.
Oh, man, that sounds awesome. I definitely want to hold that letter in my hand. That sounds incredible. And you touched on one. That's I think one of the biggest myths out there is, in fact, we had an atheist on our podcast just last month, and he just that wasn't even the point of the discussion, but he just casually mentioned it, about, well, most of the founding fathers, they were deists. And of course I had to stop him there, but this is what everyone is taught in school. Tell us about what were they actually?
Yeah, so just as an example, at the time of the signing of the Declaration, 56 men signed the Declaration. It's been documented that 55 of those 56 men were members of Orthodox denominations, Christian denominations, at the time they signed. The only one who wasn't a member of an Orthodox denomination was Benjamin Franklin. But not even Benjamin Franklin was a deist, because Benjamin Franklin's a guy that at the Constitutional Convention, when everything's falling apart, Benjamin Franklin has this very famous call to prayer where he says, we have all these problems. Why haven't we hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers were heard. They were graciously answered. I actually can quote much of his prayer because I talk about it so much. But the reality is, Benjamin Franklin's proposal to help the founding fathers overcome their frustrations and disagreement was we should pray. Now, why does that matter? Because most people would acknowledge, well, Franklin believed there was a God, but a deist is someone who believes that although there is a God, that God is disconnected. It's like the clockmaker theory. They wind up the world and they turn the world loose, and now you're on your own. Well, if you're on your own, then God's not going to intervene in what's happening today. Franklin believed that not only should they pray, he reflected that during the American Revolution, he said, we prayed every single day for divine protection. He said, our prayers were heard and they were graciously answered. So if you're asking God to intervene and you've acknowledged we've already prayed and God already has intervened, well, that's nothing close to an atheist, agnostic, or deist. Now, to be clear, I would not argue that Benjamin Franklin was a Christian. I think, and this is where there's a lot of confusion in the way the narrative is told today, because either you're Christian or you're anti-Christian. Well, no, like there's some gap in between, right? There can be people that, just as an example, modern culture, where you have people that are acknowledging they would be cultural Christians. Like I think Elon Musk acknowledged, like I think I'm a cultural Christian because I kind of agree with some of the morals of it, but like I'm not really a Christian myself.
Richard Dawkins admitted to being a cultural Christian.
Right. The famous atheist
That's
Richard
right.
Dawkins even acknowledged that.
Yeah.
But Benjamin Franklin, again, I wouldn't argue he was a Christian, but he certainly was a promoter of Christianity because he saw pragmatically the benefits of it. But just as an example, Benjamin Franklin, for those that don't remember, he was an elementary school dropout, never had really this formal education, but because of his brilliance in so many areas, Yale had given him an honorary degree. And the president of Yale toward the end of Franklin's life was a pastor named Ezra Stiles. And back then, every university president was a pastor because every university back then was a Bible college where part of their goal was to teach kids from that denomination how to be better ministers of the gospel, how to be grounded in their faith. And so it was a Bible college. So Yale, or the president of Yale, Ezra Stiles, writes Franklin a letter and says, we want to honor you. We have this great hall. We want to hang a portrait, but we don't have a portrait. So Ezra asks him, he says, Ben, I'm sure in your long years, you've had lots of paintings. Would you mind giving us one? It doesn't have to be your favorite, the best, like just anything. We just want to put it up so that we can honor you as one of our distinguished alum. And in this request, he finishes, and then he had his postscript, and he says, P.S., he says, I mean no offense in asking this question. I'm just curious. Where do you stand on the position of Jesus? And Ezra Stiles says, look, I wish all men were as I am, that they know him as the Savior, as divine. And he goes to his long accolade. He says, but I've never heard you talk about it. I'm just curious, what's your position on Jesus? He says, but I mean no offense. If this is offensive, forget I asked it. Don't even think I asked it. I wouldn't want this to drive a wedge in our friendship. And he sends a letter. And that was 3 months before Franklin died. About a month and a half later, Franklin sends his response. And Franklin, first of all, one of my favorite things, Franklin was so witty, but also he was so human. And Franklin writes back and says, well, you're correct. I do have lots of portraits, but I don't want to send you any of them because in all my portraits, I look old and fat, and I don't want to be remembered as an old fat man. And it's just great because you're like, well, bro, at some point, like if the shoe fits, that's just who you are. But he says, there's this new painter in from Europe. I heard he's really good. I'm going to see if he can paint me a little different so I look a little better. And if so, then I will send you that painting. He says, in regard to your question about Jesus, he said, I'm not offended. He said, but it's interesting because that's not really a question people ask me. He said, but if I were to give an answer, I would have to spend a lot more time thinking and researching because this is not an answer somebody should give flippantly. They should actually study to know, was he truly the Son of God or was he just a good prophet? Franklin says, I've never studied to know for sure. He says, but I can tell you, this is my code of faith. He says, I believe there is one God, the creator of the universe. He rewards the good. He punishes the wicked. I do believe there's an afterlife. I believe he's given us the Old and New Testament by divine inspiration as a guide and instruction for us on how to live life. He said, I'm just not sure if Jesus is truly divine or if he's just the greatest prophet we've ever had. Now, Franklin sends that letter a month and a half before he dies. I think it's totally possible. The Holy Spirit was like, look it up real quick, right? Like, I think it's totally possible Franklin could have investigated Jesus, have come to the saving knowledge through Jesus, and I think it's totally possible he's in heaven. But certainly, with a month and a half left of his life, I wouldn't argue he's a Christian because he said, I'm not sure if Jesus is divine and Jesus is the only way to the Father. So you kind of have to know Jesus to be saved. So I'm not arguing Franklin's a Christian, but by Franklin's own acknowledgement that there is a God, the creator of the universe, that he rewards the good, he punishes the wicked, that he's given the Old and New Testament by divine inspiration. Franklin was never anti-Christian. And again, this is where people confuse sometimes the issue. They'll say, oh, he wasn't a Christian, therefore he must have been in the atheist, agnostic, or deist category. And the reality is, I don't think he was a Christian, but he certainly was an anti-Christian. In fact, he was a promoter of Christianity. In the letter to Ezra Stiles, he says, please don't tell anybody about this, about me not being sure on Jesus. He said, I've worked my entire life to be good friends. And in fact, in my town, I actually work with all these pastors and churches. I print their sermons and their pamphlets, and I try to do so much to help them. I wouldn't want them to think less of me. And again, this is the point. Franklin was never anti-Christian, but today people say, oh, we know the founding fathers are atheists, agnostics, and deists. And I would always preface, and just for anybody listening, when you hear these kind of things said, the first thing I would encourage is you need to feel a little bit of a weight release. There's not a burden on you to defend in that position. In fact, if somebody is staking a claim, if they're making a claim, staking territory, then the burden of proof is on them to defend that. And I would just ask questions. I would say, oh, well, like, who were the deist founding fathers? And generally speaking, when someone is going to make these wide claim assertions and apply it as a generalization and say, well, we know all the founding fathers were either atheist, agnostic, and deist. When they're using generalizations, it's a pretty good idea that they don't really know the founding fathers very well. Because when I say, well, can you give me examples? They'll say, oh yeah, well, guys like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin. And I'm like, interesting. Okay, well, so you've named 3 of the 250 founding fathers. Who else was a deist? And ultimately, they're going to name every name they know, but most of the names they know are nowhere close to what they're accusing them of, but usually they don't come up with more than 5 or 6 names. And I point out, well, if you only know 5 or 6 of the 250 guys that are considered founding fathers, then how do you know they were atheist, agnostic, and deist? And just a name to keep in your back pocket, John Witherspoon was a signer of the Declaration. He was also the president of Princeton University. He personally trained more founding fathers than any other individual or any other university, what they did there at Princeton. And you actually can look at some online, incredible resume. But he was recruited to come to Princeton from Scotland. The reason he was recruited, he was a pastor in Scotland. He was part of the Scottish Awakening, kind of like the Great Awakening in America that was happening over in Scotland. They called it the Scottish Enlightenment Awakening, and he was a leading voice in that. Well, he was a Presbyterian minister. Princeton was a Presbyterian university. They needed a new president, which had to be a pastor, and they hear great things about this guy. Other founding fathers, James Wilson, Benjamin Rush, also signers of the Declaration. They recruit John Witherspoon to come be the president of Princeton University. Well, as he comes, he then starts a church there, and he's the pastor of a church on campus. He was an active pastor at the time he signed the Declaration of Independence. So when people talk about, well, we know the founding fathers weren't religious or atheist, agnostic, or deist, or separation from church and state, there's a lot of guys that are really obvious, easy examples that show how dumb that claim is. But John Witherspoon, super easy example. It's the challenge for most people is they're repeating a claim they've heard without ever having done the research themselves. Mm-hmm. And this is why asking the question not only reveals that they don't know what they're talking about, but sometimes it even reveals for them they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
Because sometimes people are confident just repeating what they've heard. And when they're challenged, they're like, oh gosh, I don't actually know. Right? It's like talking to a college kid. It's like, socialism is the best. And you're like, oh, well, can you help me identify any nation that once they've become socialistic, once they've embraced that economic system and political system, has it ever increased personal economic gain, like personal prosperity or like personal freedom? Have people gotten wealthier and more free through socialism? And they're like, well, they have to have. And you're like, look it up. And you're like, that's never happened. Right. But if they've never been asked to defend their position, then sometimes they don't realize that all they're doing is repeating what they heard some professor, what they heard some politician, what they heard some news commentator or some athlete, some music icon say a phrase, and they're repeating it without actually knowing what's truth. And that's what happens most of the time. When people say the founding fathers were atheists or agnostics or deists, they've never done that research.
Right.
And if they did, they would know how inaccurate that claim was. But again, the burden of proof is not on me to say, well, you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong. I'm going to say, oh, well, can you name all the ones that were deists, and how do we know they're deists? And what they're going to do is run out very quickly of names, number one, and number two, they're going to have almost no examples they can show you to support their claim the founding fathers were deists, because it's just not there.
Man, you're 100% speaking our language here in Men's Alliance. We're all about, reversing the burden of proof. It's on the guy who makes the claim, right? And you expose that by asking questions. You reminded me of this was back in 2020. A guy posted an article on Facebook about how the founding fathers were mostly deists. And I replied with the breakout of just the 56. I replied with the breakout of like this many were Lutheran, this many were Presbyterian, this many were Reformed, this many were Anglican, Roman Catholic, Episcopal. I broke it all down, and he just unfriended me.
Uh-huh.
It's
right.
like I thought, and then I was talking to him over coffee, and I was like, I thought you would want to know. I thought you would want to know the
Yeah.
truth. And it turns out he did not. He just wanted to say that. But you're right. People are just parroting what they've heard. They've never thought about it. And, a college professor says one thing to you, and you latch onto that, and you will think that that's true for the rest of your life until maybe somebody challenges you. And that's what's so great about what you guys are doing is you're actually equipping us with the evidence to support our claims, which, of course, is something entirely missing from the other side.
Yeah.
You mentioned separation of church and state. Let's go to there. Let's attack that one. This is a thing we hear parroted all the time. Separation of church and state. Tell us where that actually comes from.
Yeah. So for anybody that's done any research on this at all, it's not hard to find where it comes from, number one. But number two, it's not in any official governing document. When people say, well, separation of church and state is in the Constitution. No, it's not. It's in the Bill of Rights. No, it's not.
You mean it's not in the Constitution?
What? Yeah, no. They're like, it's in the First Amendment. I'm like, have you read the First Amendment? Because the first section deals with religion. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And they'll say, well, but it means separation of church and state. And I'm like, cool. So when the founding fathers in the first Congress, 1789, one of the things they're tasked with, because when the Constitution was written in 1787, it's sent to the states and it has to be ratified. As it's being ratified, there are a lot of states, and actually there was many founding fathers who were loud voices and advocates saying, guys, we need some better checks and balances on the federal government, because it doesn't tell the federal government what they can't do. And the other founding fathers are like, hang on, you're tripping out. We told the federal government they can only do these specific enumerated things. Like, we listed things. Generally, in Article 1, Section 8, when we're saying this is what the government can do, and they said, if we've told the government this is the only thing you can do, then they can't do anything else. And other founding fathers are like, we know how corrupt people are. And if you don't list things that they can never touch, they're eventually going to interfere and start doing. And so this was the debate. Now, reality sets in for many of these states and says, you know what, we better have some kind of security. This is what leads to the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is a listing of like negative things. The federal government can't do this and can't do this and can't do this. And so part of the First Amendment is the federal government can't interfere with religion or speech or press or assembly or petition. Well, the Second Amendment is the federal government can't disarm the people, can't take our guns away. And this is how it goes on through the Bill of Rights. It was a listing of negative things that the federal government cannot do X, Y, and Z. But when people say, well, yeah, but First Amendment, it means separation of church and state. Okay, so if you go to the first Congress, there's records from the first Congress, and there's records for everything they did, including every debate they had. And if you go back to the records of Congress and you look over those couple months when they're debating the Bill of Rights and they're structuring this and drafting it and they send it to the states to be ratified, you know what's interesting is there's a phrase missing from any discussion at any point in the entire time they're framing the Bill of Rights. What's missing is the phrase separation of church and state. There was not one single mention, not one, by any founding father, not even one time, when they're doing the Bill of Rights. Now, it seems like if you're saying the First Amendment means separation of church and state, somebody would have mentioned it at least one time. Nope, no mention of it anywhere. In fact, it's not until Thomas Jefferson is president and he writes a letter to a group of Baptists up in Danbury, Connecticut, that we see that phrase enter on any level whatsoever into like a political scene. But it wasn't even political. It was a political person writing a private letter to a church, explaining to them that they had written a letter to Jefferson on October 7th, 1801. He writes a letter back January 1st, 1802. But in the letter they sent to him, and these dates might be a little off, so don't hold me to that, but I think that's around the right time. When they write him a letter, they're concerned that up to this point, there was an Anglican, George Washington, and then there was a Congregationalist, and the Baptists were like, look, right now, the Anglican, Episcopalian, like they have their branch, Congregationalists, they have their branch, and those are like the two biggest branches in America. And we're afraid that eventually one of these groups are going to get the power, like take the reins and control, and they're going to mandate that everybody has to follow their belief system. Well, Jefferson in Virginia, he's the one that actually worked to bring religious freedom to Virginia, because when the founding fathers did the Constitution, I think it was 9 no, maybe 11 of the 13 colonies. They had state established religions, Virginia being one of them. They were Anglican, and Jefferson's a guy. And maybe it's time, by the time of the Declaration, it was this. Anyway, early America, they had these at the time of the founding fathers. And Jefferson's the guy who worked to bring religious freedom into Virginia, saying, we're not going to be Anglican anymore. We're going to give toleration for any Christian belief. And he said religious belief, but largely the idea was just different Christian denominations more than anything else. But he had done that for Virginia. And so the Baptists up in Connecticut know this, and they write him. They're like, hey, we are going to need your help. Can you do this as a nation and like say, hey, we can never have an official denomination that everybody has to follow? And he writes back and says, your concerns aren't really grounded. He says, I understand where you're coming from, but we've already taken care of this. He says in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, it guarantees that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Therefore, he says, we've already erected a wall of separation between church and state to keep the government from ever interfering with our religious beliefs and practices. What's so significant is when he describes this wall, the wall was to keep the government from doing anything to control religion, but it had nothing to do with saying that you can't be a Christian and be in government. And it was way later this happened, but even to give context of like, why would the founding fathers never have thought that in the first place? If you go back, let's go back to King Henry VIII as an example over in England. At that point, virtually the whole world, you're either Catholic or you're Muslim or whatever religious belief there was. But generally, when you're talking about Europe, you're either Catholic or you're a Muslim. That's kind of the large beliefs at the time. And King Henry VIII, for those that don't remember history, he was married. He really wanted a son, and his wife kept giving him daughters. And he was so upset with her, give me a son. And that's not how biology works, by the way, for those that don't remember biology class.
It's her fault.
Right. It's not the woman's fault that the gender is on the man. Nonetheless, he's like, I'm so upset. He went to the Pope and said, I want a divorce. And the Pope's like, we don't just arbitrarily give divorces because she's not giving you a son. And he's so angry. He says, you're going to give me a divorce or we're not going to be Catholic anymore. And the Pope's like, we're not doing a divorce. And he says, then I won't be Catholic anymore. And he found the Anglican Church. And he actually says that he said, I'm the leader of the Anglican Church, and as the leader of the church, I grant myself a divorce. Well, not only did he grant himself a divorce, there was other things he didn't like that were part of the Catholic Church, and he begins changing some doctrines. In fact, he even let Parliament, they actually voted and they actually passed laws on how religion would work in England. And this is actually what led to eventually the Pilgrims leaving to go to Holland, then coming to America. It's what led the Quakers with William Penn leaving and eventually coming to Pennsylvania. There's a long list of Puritans who wanted to stay and purify the Church of England. But then John Winthrop finally this is not working. We're out. This is all happening in that context. From the foundation that King Henry VIII laid, saying we're Anglican, but then laying the foundation for kings and Parliament being able to change laws. But this is also the era of the Reformation. And so this is happening actually in many places where there's a lot of the reformers. I think a lot of people even misunderstand this, where it's not like the Protestants against the Catholics per se, because all of the Protestant leaders, they were Catholic monks and priests. It's just they were Catholic monks and priests who were reading the Bible saying, this is what the Bible says. And we have the cardinal, we have this bishop, we have the Pope, or somebody telling us this is what you have to do. That's not what the Bible says. It really was a movement of either take orders and do what you're told, or we're going to do what the Bible says. It's probably a more honest way to look at it. Nonetheless, you have a lot of people breaking off, starting their own thing. And so it leads to Martin Luther. We know about him taking his 95 Theses, nailing them to the door. Well, in Germany, they become Lutheran, and they actually mandate it. And they say, if you're not Lutheran, then you have no privileges. Well, that's what they're doing in England. They said, if you're not Anglican, you have no privileges. In fact, in England, they passed a law that you could not meet, if there was a group of 4 or more people, you could not meet and talk about faith because they were afraid you were doing underground churches. And this is actually what led to guys like William Penn, famous Quaker founder of Pennsylvania. He was in prison multiple times over in England because they kept having religious meetings. But literally, they're passing laws about who can talk about Jesus in public, about communion, just a wide range of laws they're passing. But all that is background context. The early settlers coming to America are coming from all over Europe. And this is happening all over Europe, where now religion is being mandated on these crazy levels. If you don't follow whatever the government tells you on religion, you are imprisoned. Some people were executed, they're tortured. Like, it was really, really bad. So people are coming to America pursuing religious freedom. And as an example, when the Pilgrims get here, the Pilgrims started a different idea with religious freedom and a republican form of government. Because under the king, all of the government officials were appointed by the king. And the Pilgrims actually were initially trying to get to Virginia, to the Jamestown colony, because that's where their charter was granted for. But because providentially, when they left late, there were storms that blew them north. So they're going to have to settle in uncharted territory. And they're like, we're going to have government while we're here. So the Pilgrims, they choose a pastor, and then they have elections to choose a governor. Now, why that matters is they showed we believe in a separation of institutions, but they weren't trying to secularize institutions. And this is where there's a big confusion today, where people are like, separation of church and state. No. The founding fathers believed in separate institutions, but not secular institutions, i.e., go back to the fact that every single founding father who became a governor issued prayer proclamations. Well, if you're issuing prayer proclamations, that would be a violation of separation of church and state the way we interpret it today, because that's the government encouraging and endorsing religion. They can't do that. You've misunderstood separation of church and state. It was separate institutions. It wasn't secular. And then this, by the way, is the biblical perspective. Go back and read Exodus. Go see when God is building a nation for Israel and God is giving Moses all of the law. But then God tells Moses, okay, so you're going to be the political leader, but we need somebody else over the tabernacle. Let's let your brother Aaron do it. There were two different leaders. Now, all of the law for the people politically and all of the rules and regulations for the temple, the tabernacle, were given by God. So God's a part of both of them, but there were separate leaders. They were separate. They were not secular. That was the view in early America, is we believe in separate institutions, but not secular institutions. It wasn't until 1947, there was a Supreme Court case. It was Everson versus Board of Education. And there was a Supreme Court Justice, Hugo Black, a very racist man, has lots of ties to the KKK. So he had a lot of baggage just personally, but he's the guy who changed everything. Because he said, anytime we've had a First Amendment case and people have argued separation of church and state, we've always applied it to the free exercise clause, meaning that the government can't interfere with religion because it would be interfering with free exercise and that'd be wrong. He said, but I think we've misapplied it. I think we should start applying it to the establishment clause. And what that means is the government has to make sure we're not establishing religion. So anytime someone does a religious activity in public, we probably ought to start trying to work to stop that because they're trying to establish a religion. Well, that's not at all what the founding fathers were talking about. When the founding fathers said we're not going to establish a religion, they're saying we're not going to make everybody be Anglican or Catholic or Lutheran. It had nothing to do with saying that we believe there is a God. And by the way, the reason they never would have gone for that, the reason this whole argument is utterly ridiculous considered in context, is because the very notions of our government are built on the idea that there was a God, that he gave us rights, and that government's job is to secure those rights. Well, if we're saying that, no, we have to be so secular, we can't acknowledge or talk about God, then where do our rights come from? Because either there's a God and he gave us rights, or there is no God and government's God and government gives us rights. And this is the dichotomy we see today. When people argue separation of church and state, they're saying, no, we don't want God apart. But if there is no God, there can be no godly morals. If there are no godly morals, well, then we have this major dilemma of, well, then who gets to determine right and wrong? Because don't be confused. Every single public policy is somebody determining right and wrong, right? We pass laws because we think something is good or something is bad. That's how we pass laws. So it's not a question of if we have morals. It's only a question of whose morals are we going to follow. And the founding fathers unequivocally, unquestionably argued the greatest morals were those of the Bible, which is why they didn't work to secularize our government. They worked to actually infuse the principles of religion and morality into the government, knowing it would make it work better. So when people argue separation of church and state, frankly, they just don't understand history, and they've only bought into the modern framing and shaping of the debate by people who are trying to remove God. And by the way, why would politicians want to remove God from the equation? Because in every single nation for the history of the world, there were only two options. You either had a really big God or you had a really big government. You didn't have both. Because either it's my God shall supply all my needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus, or It's the government will meet all my needs. And they understand that if we can minimize God, then we have the power of government. And this is what we see with so many politicians. Even good-hearted people, the longer you are involved in politics, usually the dirtier your hands get. And it's a grab for money and power. And reducing this notion of God in government, it elevates them to say, no, we have to be the ones making decisions. We have to be the ones in charge. And this is exactly the opposite of what the founding fathers intended. They had dealt with monarchs. They had dealt with tyrants. They had dealt with dictators. They didn't want to deal with that anymore, which is why they set up a system where we, the people, are supposed to be in charge, where there's accountability, there's checks and balances, but also it's why George Washington, in his farewell address, as he gave some of the best advice any president's ever given. The farewell address is considered the most significant political dissertation ever delivered by any kind of political figure, but certainly by any president. And part of the advice he gave, he warns like, hey, don't get entangled with all these foreign issues. All nations, because also at the time, France and England, they'd been in these ongoing wars for like hundreds of years. And he's like, guys, don't get involved. Like, let Russia and Ukraine figure this out, right? We don't need to be the ones solving the. No, I'm sorry, not Russia and Ukraine. It was England and France. Might as well be Russia and Ukraine, right? Little parallel. He's like, hey, avoid foreign entanglements. It's not our job to solve every problem everywhere in the world. Now, I understand why politically we might have some motivation on some level, but it's different than what we were doing in previous presidential administrations, like a couple of years ago. Nonetheless, he goes on and says, avoid debt. Like, stay away from it because this can destroy a nation. He talked about that we have to love principles more than we love party. Don't just cheer for your team to win, cheer for principles. And that is more important than loving party. Like, so much good advice he gives. But the most significant advice, I think, he says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are the indispensable supports. Now, there's only one time in the entire farewell address he said something was indispensable. And indispensable means you can't do it without. He says, we will not be politically prosperous. We cannot succeed as a nation without religion and morality. And when he says religion, he's not talking about like arbitrary, you choose your religion, whatever's right for you. They're very clear if you study their writings. When they're talking about religion, they're talking about Christianity. When they talk about morality, they're talking about the morals of the Bible. So they're talking about without Christianity in the Bible, this thing is not going to work. And again, why that matters is because they went the exact opposite direction of what today we hear argued with separation of church and state. They knew, no, our kids need to learn basic morals. They need to learn basic rights and wrongs. And it's not subjective. It's not, well, this is your truth, this is my truth. No. It's not subjective. There are objective moral standards and things that have worked for the history of time, like 10 Commandments, written in stone, still one of the best moral guides ever in the history of the world. Well, right, it's because God gave them as the framework for how to build a nation. It's the way we interact with God. It's the way we treat people. It's great, yes. That's why it used to be in every single public school. It wasn't until 1980 that the U.S. Supreme Court said no more 10 Commandments in public school. This is literally the moral framework we built education on, is religion and morality. And so again, when people argue separation of church and state, they don't know the history, they don't know the context, and they're buying into the lie that people are saying we want to remove God from government. Why? Because it's politicians who want government to become more powerful so they have more power and money, not because it's best for the nation or kids or students or families or anything else.
Amen. Has money gotten in the way of how God can use you? Let me tell you about Tom Love, certified financial planner with the Main Street Group. Tom Love from Tuckahoe Tribe, a.k.a. Doc, can absolutely get you squared away with your finances. My wife and I use Doc to handle our personal finances, and his team is second to none. Tom is a certified financial planner. He's a Dave Ramsey SmartVestor Pro. He's been ranked top 40 under 40. He's been ranked number 2 in Richmond Times Dispatch. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal. And make sure you mention Men's Alliance whenever you reach out to Doc. He gives Men's Alliance, Tip of the Spear Ministries, a portion of the proceeds when you invest through him. He's a fee-only fiduciary, which means he doesn't make money unless you make money. So check out Tom Love at the Main Street Group. Wow, that's absolutely spot on. That's a lot to digest. Is there what do you recommend we do about this today? What's our best course of action?
Well, first of all, let me also apologize. you can tell, right? Like you winding me up and let
You're
me go.
passionate,
and like,
man. That's how
I
I
care
am.
about
That's
this.
how I am when people get me talking about Men's Alliance. I'm the exact same way.
So, yeah, I am not trying to like filibuster as we're having this conversation. But so what can we do about it? If people don't know, in 2022, there was a very famous Supreme Court decision. It was a Coach Kennedy decision. Coach Kennedy was a football coach from Bremerton, Washington, who at the end of the football game, he'd gone out to the 50-yard line. He took a knee just to pray and thank God. He was a 20-year Marine veteran. And he wanted to do something to honor God. He ends up getting fired for doing that up in Washington. His case takes nearly 9 years. Finally, the Supreme Court comes down and clarifies he was wrongfully terminated. But part of why he'd been terminated, part of why every single lower court said that you as a teacher, you can't have a silent prayer even if it's after an athletic event. Like, you're no longer on the clock, but because kids know you're a teacher, you can't pray anywhere they can see you because it violates separation of church and state. Now, utterly ridiculous, but this is part of that conversation and argument. And the Supreme Court said, okay, so what the lower courts were citing as the reason, in 1971, there was a case at the U.S. Supreme Court called Lemon v. Kurtzman, and the question came up of, well, what can you do as a person of faith? What expressions, what activities can you do in public? And they said, we need to come up with a test so that people can evaluate what they can and can't do. And what the test, it was known as the Lemon test. What the test ultimately did is it set parameters and boundaries around expression and activity. And the essence of the test was you can only do a religious activity or expression if you can prove you are doing it for a primarily secular purpose. Now, what religious activity or expression am I going to do for secular reasons, right? Like, that makes no sense at all, but that was kind of the point, is they wanted to censor religious expression and activity. And through this test, there was virtually nothing that was able to pass the test of saying, I'm only doing this for secular reasons. And so in the next 50 approximate years, the Lemon case was cited more than 7,000 times to stop religious activity or expression in federal court. So you're talking about just thousands upon thousands of cases where people lost their religious freedom. Well, in 2022, in the Coach Kennedy decision, when the Supreme Court heard the reason you fired this guy at the end of a football game for taking a knee, like he's posturing, but this is also like the era of Colin Kaepernick, right? Like, Colin Kaepernick can take a knee for the anthem, but you can't take the Tim Tebow knee because we know you're a person of faith and that's unconstitutional. And they're like, this is crazy. And they said, but it's because we know you're posturing like that because you're a Christian and it's religious. Therefore, that posture is unconstitutional because you're religiously motivated. Utterly ridiculous. But the Supreme Court says you're only saying you can't do it because of this 1971 Lemon test. And that Lemon test has been used abusively to take away Christians' First Amendment right, where they can have no expression because of their faith, and that's unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court said, so we are overturning that Lemon decision. And Coach Kennedy, he gets reinstated, right? All the back pay, like all kinds of good stuff. But what's significant is they said, we're overturning the Lemon decision. Well, the Lemon decision is what said we can't have the 10 Commandments in schools. Lemon decision is what said we can't have prayer at high school football games or basketball games or volleyball games or baseball or softball games or soccer games. I mean, you go down the list. The Lemon decision is what changed so much. Well, now it's overturned, which means we have, again, the Lemon decision was cited more than 7,000 times in federal court as the reason for taking away religious expression or activities. Well, now that means that we have thousands upon thousands of areas that we can work to restore. There has never been a better opportunity to restore and advance some of what has been lost in our culture than where we are right now. And we could also acknowledge like some of the political consequences. When President Trump was elected in 2016, he had the chance to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. And even though the justice he appointed, they're not, the way the Supreme Court makeup is there's 9 justices, there's 3 liberal, there's 3 conservative, and there's 3 kind of squishy in the middle. Well, President Trump, 2 of the 3 he appointed are kind of squishy in the middle. And we could argue because he had some bad advice by people promoting some of these names. Nonetheless, even though they're kind of squishy in the middle, they've come down on the constitutionally understood correct side from the founder's perspective, original intent. They've come down on the right side of these issues saying, yes, you should have some basic religious freedom restored. And so something that we can do as men, as people of faith, we actually can work to restore some of these things where at city council meetings, at school board meetings, we actually can start with prayer in these gatherings. We actually can encourage our kids. Hey, when you're in school, you actually, every single school day can start with prayer. That can happen again. And in school, some of this, like the way that it's clearly defined legally right now, where like there's no question about it, is any student can lead the prayer constitutionally, no question. Where there is a question is, can a teacher do that? And they're saying, well, we're not sure because that might be too much influence and it could be considered like a captive audience because they're students, they have to be at school. But if a student does it, there's no question. And that's the way federal court looks at it. Again, why that matters is because we haven't won the battle getting back all the way to like foundational America where the founding fathers were, where the founding fathers are the ones that were promoting and encouraging the Bible and Christianity to be the most prominent thing done in American education. We're not quite there yet, but we are on a place that we can start regaining some of the ground that was lost. And so again, if you have kids in school, tell them, hey, you know what? You need to ask your coach. Tell your coach, we want to do this. I'm behind you. I support you. And if there are challenges there, at this point, there are so many great religious organizations out there, and specifically not just religious organizations. There are religious liberty nonprofit law organizations like First Liberty. Kelly Shackelford's that leader. There's Alliance Defending Freedom. There's Liberty Counsel with Matt Staver. There's Pacific Justice Institute. There's, a very, very long list of some really great organizations that anytime a teacher, a student, a parent, a pastor, even if you're in your workplace and they're like, hey, you can't have a Bible on your desk or you can't have some Bible verse, right, displayed, whatever, they represent you for free to help restore some of these constitutionally protected rights that have been taken away over the last many decades. So what we can do now is we can work to advance and restore some of that. There's a great website called Restoring Faith in America, RFIA.org, restoringfaithinamerica.org or RFIA.org, where you can find out what can I do as a parent, as a teacher, as a student, as a boss, as an employee, as a coworker, like where are the boundaries of what I can do to try to restore some of what's lost. But there has never been a better time to restore a faith foundation in our nation. And what George Washington acknowledged is that religion and morality are the indispensable supports to our political prosperity. The following year when John Adams became president, he wrote a letter then to the Massachusetts militia, a very great letter. It's like 4 paragraphs. It's super easy to read. But there's a very famous line, and I would encourage you to read the whole letter. It really is worth it, but you can find it by this line. He said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, when John Adams says our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people, what is he talking about? Well, in America, we believe in giving freedom to people, but freedom only works if you have a moral people. Because you give freedom to immoral people, all that happens is immoral things. And it's like Chicago every weekend, right? Like all this gang violence, all these issues, all this theft, all kinds of problems. Well, right, freedom doesn't work if we don't have a moral foundation upon which we can build with freedom. And this is why the founding fathers said religion and morality, it's indispensable, or that our Constitution, it was only made for religious and moral people. And we are now at a place we've seen now for decades. We've been having kids go through school where they're not being taught a religious and moral foundation. In fact, unfortunately, there's even some churches and pastors that aren't even teaching some of the religious and moral foundation in our nation today. But as men, as leaders, we actually can work to restore that for our own families. We can encourage that to be restored for our kids and in school. And so we can do things now to build a foundation that will allow America to function and thrive again. Dave, I hear a lot of people that talk about this slogan, Make America Great Again. And I think, personally, I think it's a great slogan because I know the foundation of our nation, that America's been the most free, stable, prosperous nation in the history of the world. Like setting history, I recognize how unique and special America is, and I want to make her great again. But I also know you can't make her great again if you don't know what made her great in the first place. And what made her great in the first place was having a foundation of Christianity in the Bible, that religious and moral foundation. And if we don't restore that, then we'll never be able to restore what this notion of Make America Great Again, what that actually means. Because making America great again is not just good economic policy. It's not just good immigration policy. I mean, you go down the list. Those are very, very important things. But if we restore some of those basic things, but we don't restore a moral underpinning, then all we're doing is putting Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It's not ultimately going to solve the problem. We have to do something far more significant, and we have to work to restore that religious and moral foundation, bringing Christianity and the Bible back, especially for rising generations. And if we can do this for our kids, for our grandkids, we can build a foundation that America can once again be this really special place, not because America and Americans are special, but because God's ways work. And if we will restore and build on God's word and build on what God said, we will be successful because, again, God's ways work, and God's ways only work every single time.
Yeah. I think a lot of men listening to this, you're kind of awakening in our listeners a desire to learn more American history, and not just for the sake of learning it, but for the sake of educating our kids and telling our kids so that they can not just buy into the myths that they're hearing in school, but that they can take that firm stand as well. Are there any specific resources that you would recommend to a dad so that maybe he could learn this for the first time with his kids about the truth about American history?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of great resources out there. I would, first of all, encourage our website, wallbuilders.com.
Okay.
We also have a couple of books that are story books, but they're American story books. And so it's all story oriented. It's footnoted in the back. And I want to say it's very story oriented because most people, so many history books as they are written, it's far too academic. It's dates and dead people. There's not a story there. And we come from a place that we recognize something very different. When you study the Bible, as an easy example, in the Bible, most of us, especially if we've been people of faith, we've heard the story of like Moses, Israelites, Red Sea. We've heard Joshua, the Battle of Jericho. We've heard David and Goliath. And if that was a modern academic endeavor, if I were to ask you a modern academic question, the question would be, in what year did Moses cross the Red Sea?
Yeah.
Right? In what year did the walls of Jericho come down? In what year did David kill Goliath? Why? Because that's part of how it's an easy question to ask to see, like, what do we know? But the bottom line is it's totally contradictory to what the Bible teaches. Because if you study the Bible doesn't tell us what year any of that happened. Why? Because that's not the point of the story.
Doesn't matter.
The point is to learn the story.
Yeah.
And there's morals we can take away from the story. There's life lessons we can take away. So we wrote these history books, The American Story, The Beginnings, and then The American Story, Building the Republic. We wrote them in story form as a much easier and more digestible way. But also on our website, we have a resource tab, and you can go to original documents where we have over 100,000 documents from early American history in our collection. And we have thousands of them that are scanned, high-res images, uploaded. You actually can go and read some of these original prayer proclamations. You actually could even print them off. Like, you could have them and read in front of with your kids. Letters from every single founding father, from presidents. So there's a lot of great places you can go and find this. Also, there's a website, founders.archive.gov, where it's writings. Basically, there's thousands and thousands of volumes from all the founding fathers, but different founding fathers, there's hundreds of volumes of their writings. And this is a place you actually can go and search their writings, and it's an actual letters. So the letters that led to these book volumes, no, they have the actual letters, federal government, Smithsonian Library of Congress, and they scan these and they make them available, but it's all searchable. It's text searchable. And so you can go to George Washington's letters and you can type in any question you want to know, or any keywords you're looking for, and you can find it. But we have links to that on our website as well. So there's a lot of great ways to learn these stories. We also have a social media, really every kind of platform, but we're all over social media, and we will tell different stories throughout the week. We give different presentations telling these stories, and we'll upload some of those to our social media as well. So I would encourage, go to wallbuilders.com, and lots of great resources there for people that want to know more of the story of America.
Man, that is so great. I'm always looking for resources for dads, and we will put that in the show notes for sure. I want to ask you, can you just speak for a moment to the uniqueness of America? Because I really feel like, I know that if you are, a fish doesn't know that it's wet, right? And so if you've only ever lived in the United States, you think that the whole world is how your world is, and you don't really understand our country until you get outside of it. Speak to what really is different about this country.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great things we can point to, but as some easy examples. There was a study done by a university several years ago to see what is the average length of a constitution in world history. I think it actually was Chicago Law School. They were doing something for a law review article, but they studied the history of the world. How long does a constitution on average last? And an average constitution in the history of the world lasts between 17 and 19 years. The American Constitution is so September 17th is Constitution Day. It's when we celebrate when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution. Every single September 17th, we set a new world record. We are now coming up. We're in the high 230s of how old our Constitution is. No nation in the history of the world has had a constitution that's lasted longer than our Constitution has here in America. Our Constitution also was so unique in that it was built on not having a unique set of individuals at the top. No, it was built on we the people. The power lies in the people. That was something that nobody else was doing on that level. But what's interesting is it wasn't a democracy. People often hear today that we're a democracy. We're not. We're a republic. I mean, go back and remember the pledge. And to the republic for which it stands, when we pledge the flag, right, we're a republic. Why? Because as a republic, the founding fathers understood very strategically things that happened, which even as a Bible example, right? When Jesus is about to be crucified, when he comes entering in, right, Palm Sunday, he's riding in, people are laying down palms, they're taking off their coats, they're praising, this guy's amazing, praise Jesus. Right, 5 days later, they're chanting, crucify Jesus, give us Barabbas. That's how democracies work. Democracies are, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration, he called it a mobocracy. It's the mood of the mob, and you can sway the mob with emotions. Well, that's not how we are. We are a republic. We elect officials, and they represent us, and there's a process by which legislation happens, by which laws are made, and there also are checks and balances because we are a constitutional republic. So we agreed, here's our framework. The Constitution is our framework. So when we elect officials, they can't do things that violate that framework. And part of our framework is built on the idea that there is a God, that God gave us rights, and government exists to protect those rights. So this is where when you look at most nations of the world, they're not built on the idea that there's a God and God gave them rights. If you go over to Europe, you do not have God-given rights hardly anywhere in Europe. In fact, J.D. Vance over in Europe not very long ago was talking about you guys don't have free speech. You're arresting people for putting posts on social media, for retweeting things.
That has been so shocking. That's been like a very bright reminder of how we're different. Right? When you see people going in people's homes, arresting them for what they put on Facebook.
And it's not because we don't have people in America that feel that way. There are people in America that are like, you should be arrested for, like, I mean, remember when COVID was happening and there were people that were like, you're spreading disinformation, you're going to kill grandma and all these kids. Like there were people that wanted to arrest individuals, wanted to put us like in internment camps until we got vaccinated. Like it was crazy. Right. There are crazy people in America too. But we have the check and balances that we have enshrined in a constitution, the principle from the Declaration that we have God-given rights. And government's job is to protect those rights so that you can't take away my freedom of speech. That's a reason we have court cases over this, arguing for the freedom of speech, because it's not subjective. It's not arbitrarily given to individuals. No, it's God-given, and government exists to protect that. These are things, and by the way, I could go down a list of 15 or 20 things where we are very, very different. But this is some basic notions. The fact that we've had more stability, we've had more prosperity, we've had more freedom, we actually have better equality. And don't be misled by what's happened over the last couple of years with all of this race tension that has been stirred up and generated. No. We have more equality in America than virtually anywhere else in the world. It's just that there are Marxists who are trying to stir up strife between individuals that are saying, hey, you have to be in this group, you're in this group, and y'all should hate each other. That is being generated. It's not from the heart and core of who we are as Americans. And this is why in you look in politics, you will see by and large, and this is certainly true when it comes to Christians, it should be true as Christians, that we're not looking at the color of skin, we're judging by the content of character, which by the way is a Bible idea, because you go to Matthew 25, when Jesus separated the sheep and the goats, and you review, well, what was the difference with the sheep and the goats? It was how they lived and treated people. Oh, you mean the content of their character made a difference in what camp they were in? Right. Because even Jesus, as an example, was reviewing the sheep and the goats by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Well, that isn't a political idea in America. It's also a biblical idea. That's not the way it is in most other places of the world. You can't go into Africa. You can't go into the Middle East. You can't go into China. You can't go into Russia. You can't go into North Korea. Like, this is not the normal way of the world, but it is normal in America because of the foundation we were built on that's made us different than virtually anywhere else in the world.
Man, speak to how are we unique with the Second Amendment? So I lived in Japan for a few years. And, nobody has a gun there. Nobody has a firearm in their nightstand. Nobody hunts. And I know there's other countries like that as well. And, and then I feel like, I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet some money that we're probably more guns per capita. We're probably the most well-armed nation of citizens. Speak to that uniqueness.
Yeah, we definitely, to verify, are one of the best armed as far as individuals in the nation. With that being said, James Madison actually wrote about this. James Madison, he was the guy in Congress, so he's known by many as the father of the Constitution, which is a little misleading. He's one of the 5 main guys that are responsible for the Constitution. That's more fair to say. I don't know that you could argue he's more of a father than George Washington was, because George Washington's the guy at the Constitutional Convention when it's falling apart. Like, he's keeping it together. He's the one committees and organizing and doing. And without George Washington's leadership, we never have a Constitution. But also there's other guys like Roger Sherman. I mean, we can go down a list. But James Madison was one of the 5 most important. Well, then he's a member of the first Congress. He brings 20 proposed amendments of what we should do, and 12 of those. And so he leads the conversation. So he really is one of the most significant political leaders in our nation. But when they get to what we know today as the Second Amendment, one of the things that he acknowledged is that the governments in Europe do not trust their people with guns. Why? Because it would be a threat to their power. Because in America, we believe that we, the people, are in charge. We wanted to have a way that there was even a check and balance if there was a tyrant. And by the way, this is so fundamentally true. Whenever you have a dictator come to power, one of the very, very common things they do is they go and disarm the people, right? And they say, hey, it's for your own good because we need to protect you, right? But once you are all disarmed and the government is the only one with guns, then who's going to stop the government from taking away all your other God-given rights? The founding fathers said the Second Amendment is the palladium that defends all of the other rights, because by the way, it wasn't the first thing listed. The first thing was you got to be able to worship God and speak, right? Like the First Amendment were some basic things, but Second Amendment, when they're ratifying this thing, they understood that we need to have the ability, because you're going to be saying some things the government might not like, right? You might be printing some things the government doesn't like. You need to have the ability with checks and balances to be able to restrain a government. The Second Amendment was not written so that we could guarantee the right of Americans to go hunt. No,
right.
It was written to stop tyrants from tyranny. And most nations have had political leaders get in charge and they don't trust people with guns. But also, most nations were not built on the notion of God-given rights and the right of self-preservation. The founding fathers called it the laws of nature and nature's God. God revealed himself both through creation and through his word. And one of the things that is visible and evident in the word of God and very evident in creation is everything God made, God gave them the ability, this self-defense, self-preservation instinct. So whether it runs or it fights or it flies, it claws, it bites, whatever it does, God put self-preservation in everything God made. Why does it matter? Because then self-preservation is not antithetical to what the Bible teaches. This is part of how God made it to operate. And so they understand if God's given us the right of self-defense, then you need to have the ability to defend yourself. And they recognize there can be some disadvantages. There was an old adage back in the 1800s that God made all man, but Sam Colt made them equal. The
Yeah.
revolver, right? Now, I don't agree with that spiritually, but I appreciate the sentiment behind it, because so as an example, I'm a 40-year-old guy. I do jujitsu. I've done firearm training much of my life. I am a very comfortable, competent person. But if I had to go up against like some 300-pound dude, 400-pound dude, that could be intimidating for a guy that's in the 160s. But if I am having my life threatened and I have a firearm, it's an equalizer. And by the way, this is no different for a woman, right? I'm 160 something pounds, but if there's a 115 pound woman, there needs to be an equalizer. This is what the founding fathers understood is the reason. And by the way, not only did they support individuals having guns, they actually, in some of their states, some of their counties, there were actually some county or city ordinances that required you to own a gun if you lived inside city limits. And if you didn't have the money to buy a gun, you couldn't buy a gun with your own money, they would loan you money at no interest to buy a gun that you would pay back as soon as you could, because they believed in gun ownership. Why? Because, and we know this is like a no-brainer. If you pass a law, because we're going to protect the people, who obeys the laws? Law-abiding citizens. So if we're saying, hey, you need to give up your guns, who's going to give up their guns? The law-abiding citizens. Who's not going to give up their guns? The criminals. They're criminals because they don't obey the law. So now all you've done is you've allowed the criminals to be armed and the government to be armed, but not the law-abiding citizens to have a way to defend themselves. And again, this is part of why the founding fathers did this. They understood the right of self-preservation is a God-given right. It's something that God has put in creation. And if God has given us the mental capacity to come up with a way to defend ourselves at a higher level, i.e. a firearm, then that's something we should protect because it's part of the means of you defending yourself. And that's part of this law of nature and nature's God, the right of self-preservation. So the founding fathers believed in this from, number one, a self-preservation instinct, and number two, from a threat against tyranny. So the Second Amendment was dual fold, but bottom line is they believed that you should have the ability to carry guns because the founding fathers, even though they were politically in charge, they understood that it's only a matter of time before you elect officials whose hearts aren't in the right place, and you might need to have a way to remind them that they can't come take away the rights that God has given you, and that's part of what the Second Amendment was for.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder that it's not just about personal home defense and hunting. It's about actually stopping the government, right, from becoming a tyranny. Tim, as you speak and you talk to a lot of people on these topics, is there any one or two things that you've noticed typically surprise people? What is something you share that you find people had no idea about?
I mean, honestly, there's so much. We live in American history, and most people, I think a lot more people are starting to pay more attention now. I think people are starting to learn more now. I think one of the things that has been becoming much more readily apparent is how poor most people's education was growing up. That even though we could have some heroes and like, man, so I know you're in Virginia. And so if you're in Virginia, you're like, man, right? We love Washington or Jefferson or you name who it was. Now, obviously, over the last years, there's been people trying to cancel them because they are Marxists who don't know history or who hate America. And that's why they're trying to cancel some of these people who are heroes because lots of reasons. I don't want to trail too much on that, but like it's very frustrating. Like, okay, so real quick side trail because it bothers me. But like even Robert E. Lee, when people are like, oh my gosh, Confederate, like this dude's the worst. Okay, like I understand. And I know you in Virginia will have a very different understanding because probably y'all have studied some Virginia history. You know a lot more than most people do. Robert E. Lee was not pro-slavery for everybody listening right now. When the South, when Lincoln gets elected, there's a move in the South to secede, and Lincoln is not even elected yet. And by the way, it was politically motivated in many states by very pro-slavery people. And not to trigger anybody, when there were 11 states that seceded, but of the ones that seceded, the early ones, and there were 5 states that when they seceded, South Carolina is the first one, but as they seceded, they released a secession ordinance and their Declaration of Causes. Their Declaration of Causes is like their version of the Declaration of Independence. Go back and read those Declaration of Causes, and it's super fascinating because none of them say the reason we're leaving is states' rights. All of them say we're leaving over the slavery issue. Now, that doesn't mean that's all the people. That's you, which as an example, like Nancy Pelosi is from California, Gavin Newsom, California. I know some great Christians in California that are like, I disagree with them all the time. Right. just because somebody's politically in charge doesn't mean they represent everybody that is under them, right? So I'm not trying to say that, but Lincoln, as he sees the South seceding, he's like, hey, we need to do something. He calls Robert E. Lee, who's like the top guy, who's this best general leader there is, and he says, hey, I'm gonna need your help. We're gonna have to put a stop to this. I need you to lead the Union Army and go stop this. And Robert E. Lee says, I'm not in favor of slavery. So if I could end this by giving you every slave in the South, I would end it right now. I just don't have that power. He says, but if there's going to be a war, and there's a war that's going south, I could never lead an army that's going to go into Virginia and elsewhere, because I have family and friends, and they're going to fight on the side of Virginia, and I couldn't lead an army that kills my family and friends. If there's a war, President Lincoln, I'm not against you, but I would have to go to help try to fight to defend my family and friends. Now, also keep in mind, in Virginia at the time, the law was it was illegal to educate any black person, because you couldn't educate slaves, because part of what they understood is that the better educated somebody is, then the more they're going to desire freedom, and we just need to keep them controlled by keeping them ignorant. Robert E. Lee is educating black slaves. He's doing his Sunday school for them, teaching them to read and write, teaching them the Bible, love Jesus. Like this guy is not the monster he's made out to be today. If we knew some basic facts, he's the guy actually working at the end of the Civil War to help bring some restoration between North and the South. He works with Lincoln. Again, like, he's not the monster, but today people are like, oh my gosh, just cancel everybody, tear down all the statues. Right. And so I think part of what happens is, as we start to tell the story of what actually happened, and whether it's with Columbus, whether it's with Washington or Jefferson or anybody else we talk about, the Pilgrims, Jamestown, when we start to tell the story and people go, that's what happened? And we're showing the documents and we're reading it and we're going through, and they're like, I had no idea. And what they don't know is, so two things to offer. The first thing is, there are some really good-hearted people in education, and some of them don't know anything different than what they've been taught, and so they're repeating really bad information. So it's not their heart's in the wrong place, but then some people are motivated that they're much more Marxist in their ideology, much more pro-communist, pro-socialist. And for those that don't know, like, those people are all over academia. The majority of college professors today are supportive far more of socialism, communism, Marxism than they are of capitalism and the American system. Okay, like that is absolutely statistically correct with some of the polling that's been coming out. But there are people that are very motivated against the truth, but that's part of them. But then on the other side, it's not just people that are promoting this certain agenda. You also have people that have never done any research, and so they don't know anything about anything. So they're not motivated. It's not that they're just ignorant. It's that I'm literally just reading the text. Or some people, they will read professors' books and they're like, well, this professor, and so they try to add commentary to it. But most academics today, when they're doing writing, they quote far more modern sources and other professors. Like, well, if you want to know more about this, review so-and-so professor's work, and then you can review so-and-so professor's work. They're citing professors instead of the original documents. What we do, and what we would encourage everybody to do, is stop. It's like, why do we not tell people to go look at Wikipedia for the answer? Because Wikipedia is an open encyclopedia, incredibly biased in a very left, liberal, secularist bent. They're anti-Christian, anti-conservative. And even though you can find some basic like dates, names, and places on Wikipedia, the information on there is just awful in the biased sense. Well, this is what happens with most professors. And most texts, or most even history books, storybooks today, they're citing professors rather than original documents. And if you want to know the truth, go back to original documents. And the thing that blows most people's minds that we see today is when we go to original documents, it's so much different than what they learned. It's so much deeper. It's contradictory. And I would say that's the biggest thing. It's like, it's like if the only thing you knew about the Bible is what you learned from VeggieTales, and then one day you actually read the Bible, you're like, this is so different than what I learned on Right. There's so much more that's there, and sometimes it's not the fairest or most honest representation that we've been given. And sometimes there are people motivated from the other side that are intentionally being dishonest because they're promoting an agenda. They're not trying to tell the truth. And this is where, as believers, we have to make sure that we are pursuers of truth, kind of like what the Apostle Paul did in Acts 17 when he's sharing the gospel with people that have never heard the gospel. And at this time, there's no New Testament. So he's probably like going to some of the prophets that prophesied about Jesus. Paul's probably telling them, guys, we know Isaiah prophesied about the coming Messiah. And they're like, wait a second. We don't trust you, Paul. somebody get the scroll of Isaiah. And they bring out the scroll and they read it and they're like, oh, Isaiah, he did say that. Okay, Paul, you may continue. And he's like, all right, well, thank you. Well, we know Joel also prophesied. And they're like, wait a second, get Joel. And this was the Bereans. And the Bereans would not believe anything Paul said until they looked it up for themselves. And when they did, they're like, this is amazing. This is what it actually says. I think we've become, as men, very lazy in our leadership, that we find the easy answer, which is not always the right answer. And if we're going to be better leaders, we have to make sure we're finding the truth, not just the easy answer. And to find the truth, sometimes you got to dig a lot deeper. We try to help with that at Wall Builders by saying, right, here's the quote, here's the source, so you don't have to read all their writings to find it. But we have to be pursuers of truth more than we just are comfortable in taking somebody else's word for what's actually going on.
Man, that is so good. You're absolutely right. We can't be lazy in our leadership or in our lives anywhere. As we wrap this up, I want to just give listeners enough to make them want to dig more. Did Thomas Jefferson have a kid with his slave?
So the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that one of the things that's interesting is when all of this accusation largely came to the forefront was 1998. There was a DNA test done. And actually there was guys, University of Virginia, one of the lead professors on that. He has a great article, was Jefferson America's first abolitionist? I would encourage everybody, look that up. Was Jefferson America's first abolitionist? Great article. He did the DNA test. Jefferson had no sons. And the DNA is consistent in the male lineage, but Jefferson had daughters, no sons. So they went to a family member and they found a son from a family, an uncle's son, but there was nothing from Jefferson. And so what they found is there's a familial match, but there were 28 men that possibly could have been the father from the Jefferson family at that time. And by the way, it was Sally Hemings. She had 4 kids. Only one of them ever had the DNA testing. Actually, no, there were a couple of DNA testing done. Only one of them ever had any of the Jefferson, not Thomas Jefferson, but Jefferson family, large 28 male individuals living in the area at that time that could have been the potential father. But what's interesting is the guy that did the DNA test, when this came out, there was an attorney who used this. And he actually was the lead attorney for Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was going through the Monica Lewinsky scandal before the Senate, like this whole impeachment thing going on with Clinton. And this attorney, as he was trying to downplay what Bill Clinton had done, he said, hey, like, we shouldn't be free. Even Thomas Jefferson, like, even he was this kind of guy too. Like, this is just how men are. Because Jefferson, he was fathering children of the slaves. He makes his accusation. There were 219 news outlets, I think, that first printed the story. This professor, and actually the guy who actually did the DNA test came out and said, that's not what the DNA test showed. Like, there's no smoking gun. There's no silver bullet that Jefferson was the father. That's not correct at all. And when they came out with this, only 11 outlets did the retraction. And so everybody else was like, nope, we're just leaving it there. Well, this professor, who was the one that was leading this research, he is challenged now for decades anybody to have a debate with him over Jefferson fathering children, and nobody will have a debate with him because it's easier to reassert the claim than it is to defend the claim. And what we've dealt with in modern culture is that people have said a lie long enough that we've believed it to be true, and no one's actually had to defend that claim with evidence. And the people who actually did the study are begging someone, please come have the debate. But it's easier to control a narrative if you get enough people parroting the lie than it is to have an honest debate and be exposed as liars. And that's more of the topic and conversation.
So there we have yet another myth that's about as deep as a bumper sticker that everyone just accepts as common knowledge, where it's much more nuanced than that. No evidence that Thomas Jefferson had a baby with Sally Hemings. That's fascinating. People don't dig deep enough, but I hope that by hearing you today, people are prompted to go dig a little deeper, read a couple of the Wall Builders books, and find out more so that we can be the men who lead our families back to the truth of American history. Last question for you. What do you think founding fathers would say if they saw America in 2025?
Wake up. Remember, Because I think since COVID, I think a lot of people are and have begun to and are waking up. Honestly, I think we are in the middle of an awakening in America. I travel and speak all over the nation, and I see, man, God is waking people up. There is something incredible happening in our nation, and not just the fact that God divinely protected President Trump in that Pennsylvania field when he turns his head and gets his ear nicked. Like, it's so much deeper than that. God is on the move, but in the midst of God being on the move, which is hopeful and encouraging, we have forgotten the foundation upon which we were built. The founding fathers, they built this idea on, look, there is a God. And God has given us rights, and government's job is to protect those rights. And I think we are now having people reawaken to the fact there is a God. But I think we need to continue to reawaken to the fact that we have God-given rights. And the very purpose of the government is to protect and secure those rights, not to increase the tax burden, not to do all these things we're doing with frivolous spending and like what Doge is uncovering. It's unbelievable. But it's happened because we have not been good stewards with what we were entrusted. And I think as we are awakening in America, even more so around the nation, to people remembering there is a God and God has standards and principles, and I think there's something really cool happening. We have to reawaken to the fact that there is a God-given set of rights, that God has given things to us, and we don't do them because we have permission from the government. We do them with the enjoyment and protection from government because these are rights God gave us, and our government was built on the fact that your job is to protect the things that God gave us, not to invent things. You're not our protector. You're not our provider. You are the one that just makes sure that we get to practice these things that God has already given to us. And I think that's where the biggest shift has come from what the founding fathers had envisioned to where we are, because we are living under micro tyrannies like we've never seen. When COVID happened and we have mayors and we have governors like, no, you can't go to work. No, you have to shut your business down. No, you can't go in public unless you have 3 masks. I'm like, it's stupid on so many levels. Yes, it was. We have come back, maybe even if you go back and read the Declaration, there were 27 grievances of why we separated. Almost all 27 of those grievances are things we're dealing with today. We have gone full circle back to where we came from. We need to wake up and remember, what was this American experiment about? It was about getting rid of an oppressive government. It only works if we have a religious moral foundation, right? So we have to get that God thing figured out in our life. But once we do, we need to work to restore those God-given rights. And once again, remind government, your job, number one, first and foremost, is to protect those rights God's given to us.
That's so good. Wake up. Great message. I absolutely love it. Tim, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your knowledge with us. And honestly, I'm encouraged. Thank you.
Good. My pleasure.
Hey guys, listen up. I've got huge news. This coming May 2nd through 4th, we are having our first ever Men's Alliance National Rally. This is going to be the biggest, greatest gathering of barbarian ambassadors from every tribe all over the country coming together for one weekend in a state park. You can come camp out or you can stay in a local hotel, but it is going to be an incredible time. We want every tribe across the country to road trip to this rally. We are bringing you the absolute best speakers in the country. Greg Kokel, author of Tactics, founder of Stand to Reason. He will be a headlining speaker along with Stephen Mansfield, New York Times bestselling author of Band of Brothers, which has helped me start Men's Alliance. He's also the author of Men on Fire. We're going to have Pastor Brian Hughes from Passion Community Church there leading us on Sunday morning worship service outdoors. It's going to be incredible. We're going to have the Barbarian Games at the rally Friday night with live metal music performed by Saved by Scarlet. Then Saturday morning is the first national all tribes. It's going to be epic. Go to our website, click on National Rally, get your tickets. It's going to fill up. It's going to be a great time of outdoor camping, music, workouts, speakers, and sharpening one another. Don't miss the rally. To find out more about what we're doing and to join us on our mission, go to men'salliancetribe.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a 5-star review.